Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. The countdown to the Putin-Trump summit is on. The two leaders are due to meet in Alaska to discuss what peace could look like in Ukraine more than 3.5 years after Russia's invasion. While Trump has spoken to Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky ahead of the meeting, European capitals remain apprehensive that a resolution will come from it and are rallying behind Kiev. So is this latest development, in fact, a development at all, or just posturing by two men desperate to be seen to be doing something? Today on The Front Page, Kiwi journalist Thomas Mutch joins us from Ukraine to take us through the latest on the front lines and behind the scenes. So, Tom, we know that Trump and Putin are set to meet in Alaska on Friday local time. But first off, what's the significance of Alaska?
It does seem a bit of an odd choice at first. The reasons are primarily geographic. It's quite hard for Putin to go anywhere at the moment because he's wanted by the International Criminal Court. So any countries that have signed up to the International Criminal Court have an obligation to basically arrest him and hand him over. Now, the US is not and has never been a signatory to that court. So it is technically safe for him to meet in Alaska. It's also something that when you choose these kind of locations, you often want to choose something that's kind of like equidistant for both leaders. For Putin, it's just a straight flight from Moscow. For Trump, it's a straight flight from DC, and they kind of meet about in the middle. But it's also got some interesting historical significance as well, because it was sold by one of the Russian czars, I think it was Alexander I, back in around 1867 from Russia to the United States. So when we're talking about powerful people carving up spheres of influence and, handing over territories with a swath of a pen and stuff like that, there is some interesting historical legacy to it.
Now, has Vladimir Putin given any details on what the Kremlin is asking for?
So what they've said, so they first announced their conditions basically last year, and they were... Ukraine has to withdraw from all of the four major oblasts where the Kremlin controls a significant amount of the territory. That's Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And Ukraine has to agree to never join NATO. It has to basically get rid of its armed forces. And there were other things as well about Russian language, enshrining the right of the Russian language in government institutions. Not particularly important stuff. The really important stuff is over territory. And it does seem that, at least according to reports, there was one in the Wall Street Journal that said that these demands have slightly lessened, which is that they're now dropping the idea for Ukraine to withdraw from the remainder of Kherson and Zaporizhia. And, those are very, very major cities that the Kremlin has been pushed back from. So it would be very, very strange for them to be handed over. And that what they're asking for now is the rest of Donetsk Oblast, which, if you look at it on a map, doesn't look huge, and you might wonder why that territory is so important or so worth fighting for. The problem is that Donetsk Oblast is the most heavily urbanized and heavily fortified part of the country. So if Ukraine were to hand that over, they would be handing over what they call a fortress belt. It's these cities, about 4 of them in a row, that are just trenched and mined and barbed wired and just these kind of ultimate defensible outposts. And so the problem with those demands is that were the Ukrainians to give that over, not only would they be losing a large chunk of their territory and the civilians that go with it, if the Kremlin ever decided to come back in 5 or 10 years down the line, like it did in 2022 after the 2014 war, Ukraine would be fighting from a much weaker position because it would have given up its most defensible territory. If you look at it on a map, after Donetsk Oblast to Ukraine's major cities, it's pretty much just straight shooting.
I believe he wants to get it over with. Now, I've said that a few times, and I've been disappointed because I'd have a great call with him, and then missiles would be lobbed into Kiev or some other place, and you'd have 60 people laying on a road dying. I said, that's cold. That's cold. But it's a violent war. 5 to 7,000 people a week are dying. And there's nobody from here. They're all Russian and Ukrainian people, and some people from the cities, much smaller number, but still, those missiles do damage and they kill a lot of people.
So Trump is giving the impression that there will be some swapping of territories to the betterment of both. It's hard to believe that this kind of betterment would be achievable, though, right?
It's a very odd turn of phrase. And the reason for that is that, one, the Kremlin has shown absolutely no willingness to withdraw from anything except for tiny parts of land, potentially in Sumy or Kharkiv Oblast, that were basically attempted incursions that never really went anywhere, and they own like 10 kilometers of farmland here and there, or like half a ruined village or something like that. Now, the worry is that, one, Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, went to Moscow and basically apparently there was a mistranslation, and he came back saying that Vladimir Putin was actually willing to offer up much more than he actually was. And so it seems like if there are land swaps, they would they would be more likely to be in the Kremlin's favor, Ukraine giving up that large part of Donetsk Oblast that I was talking about. So that could be like a real stickler in the negotiations, because people in Ukraine are saying, well, like, Donald Trump, who are you to say what territories we're going to hand over or swap or not?
Yeah, that leads me on to, I wonder what Zelensky's thinking about all this. Has he mentioned what he thinks of the Trump-Putin meeting?
So there was a lot of discussion over, will Zelensky come? Will he be in Anchorage that day? Will he have anything to do with it? And it's looking more and more likely that no, he won't have anything to do with this particular meeting. And he has basically said the reason we can't withdraw from Donetsk is that Donetsk is going to be a springboard for a future Russian attack. I should say this is not just hypothetical, right? This literally happened. The Russians took Crimea in 2014, and Crimea became a springboard in 2022 for the most successful Russian attack of the entire war, which took really large parts of southern Ukraine.
Yeah, he's also said that it's a personal victory for Putin, and I saw that it came out that the meeting is Putin's idea. It all looks like good press for Vladimir Putin at this stage.
So this is the thing, right? We're back in 2022. You're completely right there. Back in 2022, the Kremlin effectively became kind of ostracized by the world, right? Banned from sporting events, cultural events, banking systems cut off, huge sanctions imposed on it, the works. And effectively, what being in America and shaking hands with the US president on as a partnership of equals looks like it's now you're welcoming them back into the fold. You're like, okay, you're a respected partner with whom we can do business again. And that is in and of itself a major concession in the negotiations already. It also looks bad because, as I said, Donald Trump and his advisors don't seem to have a particularly good grasp of the battlefield dynamics or even the geography or the culture of the various regions they're talking about. So it really does look like we're back in 1945 and it's Churchill and Stalin kind of drawing lines over countries and giving, noting down the percentages of dividing up the world into spheres of influence again.
What is the reality of a meeting between Putin and Zelensky at this point?
So it's difficult because the two leaders absolutely despise each other. And one of the other problems is that neither side is in a catastrophic enough military position where they're willing to sort of give it up, right? Like the Ukrainian defense is pretty strong. The Russians have taken enormous casualties, but the Russian economy and the Russian military-industrial complex seems to have enough kind of slack in it to support this level of war effort and this level of operations for like another year or two. And there's been a lot in Ukraine now about a Russian penetration of Ukrainian lines around Pokrovsk, and we don't quite yet know how serious that is, whether it's just a bunch of Russian guys got much further in the lines than they expected, or whether the Russians have actually made a significant breakthrough. But what it does do is it does give Vladimir Putin the idea that he's got battlefield momentum, however slow it is, and that he can achieve his goals by military means. What Ukrainians, I guess, are hoping for from this summit is that Donald Trump can convince him that it's going to be more painful to achieve his goals through military means than just banking whatever small wins he has now and kind of calling it quits. But I'm not incredibly optimistic.
Is there any evidence suggesting that Putin is willing to compromise or retreat even, or does the Kremlin remain kind of steadfast in its position at the moment?
So there is the little bit of leeway that the Kremlin has given has been saying that there are the two provinces, that it's not going to require withdrawal from those. Now, those provinces were like Kherson and Zaporizhia, like especially those cities. They were virulently anti-Russian. They never had, the Kremlin had never said anything about them before the start of the war. They were generally considered the Kremlin's most outlandish demands, and they have been retracted. So it does seem like there is a tiny bit of wiggle room, but at the same time, it does, Vladimir Putin and, top Russians will constantly come out and say things about how, like, Ukraine doesn't really exist and Russia should get to Odessa and, Russia's borders have no end and stuff like that. So what I think people are still tossing up is, are these signs that he's genuinely willing for a compromise, or is he willing to come to some sort of ceasefire conditions that will just mean that he will think that he can then have another bite at the apple in 5 or 10 years' time? That's what everyone in Ukraine is really worried about. Not so much specifically where the final battle lines might be drawn in this round of fighting, but how do you stop this kind of invasion happening again?
How do you stop something like this invasion happening again?
So the way a lot of Ukrainians have sort of lost faith in sort of Western institutions. So, for instance, at the start of the full-scale war, the big thing was NATO membership. Ukraine needs NATO membership and the cast-iron guarantee of Article 5. I now talk to Ukrainians, and I've spoken to people in the Baltic states as well, who say, look, we're no longer convinced that NATO is all it's cracked up to be. We're no longer convinced that the US would necessarily honor an Article 5 arrangement and, come full-throated to our defense if we were invaded or we had a Russian incursion or something like that. So, the idea of European peacekeepers had its flaws and its difficulties, but it was at least one way for European countries to have genuine skin in the game in protecting Ukraine. The only other way, as the Ukrainians have found, is unfortunately the model where you just have an extremely strong standing army, like they have in South Korea, like they have in Israel for all its issues, like they have in a number of countries where they expect that war could break out, that you just have to have an everyone has military service, the country's just full of weapons and there's minefields all over the borders, and it's not a particularly pleasant way to live, but it might be the only way to survive in this kind of new world order.
Zelensky himself has insisted that all conversations about Ukraine must be with Ukraine present. Europe has backed him up on that. A quick reminder, though, a moment like today, a virtual conference with President Trump and European leaders and President Zelensky setting out positions does echo what we saw back in May, when a ceasefire was demanded by Europe and Ukraine, and Trump was on the phone to his European allies saying he'd impose sanctions with them if Putin didn't go along with that suggestion.
And Tom, you're in Ukraine now. Whereabouts in the country are you?
So I've been living in Kiev for the last 3 years now. So look, in Kiev, like, everyone is pretty used to things that can appear sort of very shocking on the media or on TV are often not necessarily that shocking to the eyes of Ukrainians who've lived through countless air raids, who've seen the battlefield situation go up and down for years and years and years now. No one is sort of inclined to surrender, but everyone is more exhausted and more annoyed and more sort of despondent than they were before, even if there is still no real appetite to sort of surrender large parts of the country to Russia.
And in your book, The Dogs of Mariupol, there are some pretty incredible stories of just everyday Ukrainians stopping their studies, putting away their things, and just chucking on some army gear. I mean, it just speaks to the resilience of Ukrainians at this point. Is that what you found?
Yeah, so the whole point in that was about, it's the forging of Ukraine's iron generation, and this is one of the things that I said. It's that, like, so many of the people that I met in Ukraine, had really good careers, really good educations. They were intensely well educated and patriotic, and they were the ones who sort of downed tools, put on body armor, and went to the front lines. That is an extremely inspiring story, but it's also a very tragic story because in large parts, a lot of Ukraine's most promising and successful, especially young people, were the ones who ended up being killed. So there is that kind of sort of dual element of this kind of great heroism, but this kind of like really horrible sacrifice at the same time. And when the war does eventually inevitably come to an end, it's going to be a really difficult thing in society, how you deal with the memory and the legacy of what's happened.
And once the war ends, hopefully, what that will do to future generations and the future of the country as a whole.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things it's already quite an evident sort of tension in society now, but it's the tension between the troops who've been on the front line for 3 years, up to 10 years if they fought in the first war sometimes, and men who maybe stayed in the home cities and hid from mobilization squads and didn't join up in the war. There's the tensions between because women were the only women and children were the only ones who could leave. The women who stayed in their home cities and the women who left and went to Europe or the UK or Canada or wherever, that tension between, did you really go through the war? I remember once driving past a recruitment sign in Kharkiv Oblast that said, Daddy, what did you do during the war? And it's like a man 20 years in the future, holding his infant son. I thought that was a really kind of interesting and probably quite effective psychological marketing campaign. But it really does speak to, because there's going to be so many soldiers who come back from the front line at the end and they look around at people who, whether they left and then came back or just stayed in their cities the whole time, they're going to be like, we fought and watched our friends died and sometimes got maimed and mutilated, and we're all psychologically traumatized from sort of 4, 5, however many years it is of full-scale war. What do you guys, where was your sacrifice in all this?
What could New Zealand do better?
I mean, I've got to be honest. One of the things that I have consistently been annoyed about from the start is that New Zealand has almost, I think the defence minister has been once, but no New Zealand, why are there never any New Zealand officials that are visiting Ukraine? All the Australian prime ministers have done it. All the UK, prime ministers have done it. Joe Biden did it when he was US president, Ursula von der Leyen, did it as president of the European Commission several times. And especially I remember I talked to a University of Otago expert about this, whose name unfortunately escapes me, but he was like, New Zealand's, strength is in its soft power and its diplomacy. We're never going to be a military superpower, but we sort of project our values and our soft power. And I'm like, why is New Zealand in no way trying to have some kind of voice in the negotiations? For instance, it just seems that the issue is almost sort of entirely disappeared from New Zealand political discourse to the extent that it ever was there. So I think even just some kind of rhetoric from politicians, why, when Christopher Luxon is on a European tour, why does he not just come to Ukraine? I know the Ukrainians, for instance, have been trying to get a New Zealand prime minister for ages and they've had no luck. Jacinda and Chris Hipkins, they were told, no, you're just not interested. And why not? I just don't understand it. Like every other world leader has done it. Why are the Kiwis sort of not picking up the slack here?
Thanks for joining us, Tom.
No worries. Pleasure as always.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in on Monday for another look behind the headlines.